Okay, Ezekiel chapter 40, if you want to be opening your Bibles there. And there should be two handouts coming around. Tosin is very aptly handling both of those. Tosin, you need to take advantage of all these people here to help you, all these men, capable young men to help you pass things out. Two handouts, though, for tonight. One is just your normal handout for class number 42 that you can use to follow along tonight. Again, those are also found on our website under media and Bible class material. And then for tonight, and I think will come in useful the next several classes, is a diagram that pretty well translated through you scan it and then you print it and then you copy it, and the quality just gets worse and worse. And this held out decently well, although there's a few letters in the dark area. I'm seeing it better now in the light. A few letters that are harder to see in the darkest area. But you can use that diagram, look at it tonight and in the coming classes as we talk about the temple that Ezekiel saw and recorded for us in Ezekiel chapters 40 to 48. Now, on Sunday, we talked about some introductory things related to the temple, and particularly going back to look at the tabernacle and then the Temple of Solomon to understand some of the symbolism that was common in the building of these structures and the purpose for them, and how that informs our reading of Ezekiel 40 to 48. We'll continue to do some of that, even as we get into the specifics of the things that Ezekiel saw and the somewhat tedious description, at least it may seem to us, of this structure. So, at the beginning of this vision, we'll want to identify here in a minute the when and the where. So, when did Ezekiel see this vision and what's significant about that? Where does it take place? Hopefully you can recall that by the end of class. We will look at some features of the temple. Hopefully you can identify some of those features. And then by the end, hopefully if we get there, talk about some of the spiritual principles that are at work in the description of Ezekiel's temple. But I want to start with this discussion question that I want you guys to think about for a second, and then you can share out, get a few thoughts from you all as we start this study. And the question is this. We said on Sunday that essentially Ezekiel 40 to 48 is a description of God dwelling with his people. Really, say it that way, it's a beautiful thing that God would describe to us the way in which he wants to dwell, have a relationship with us. But why do that by describing a building? And again, all the tedious descriptions of this temple complex, I think to us that doesn't quite connect. We might think of other ways that God might describe how much he wants to have a relationship with us. The first thought in our mind, probably the first 10 items, 50 items, would not include, well, if he really described a detailed building, that would just really help me to see how much he wants to have a relationship with me. Right? So why? We don't know the mind of God, but if you had to guess, why might God have chosen to describe a temple complex as he's trying to communicate to Ezekiel's readers the relationship that he wants to have with them? Just spend maybe 30 seconds or 60 seconds here thinking. We'll sit in awkward silence here for a minute and just think about what might be going on, and then I'll ask you to share out. Okay, what do you think? Let's get a few answers here. No wrong answers, right? We're guessing. Why might God have chosen to describe a temple to us with this message? John, kick us off here.
I didn't see other hands go up. So, there's design, order, specificity, and that there was something to be followed to the exact nature of what was described. Almost every detail, right? And maybe that's what's trying to be communicated, is if you want this relationship with me, you need to study it as you might this chapter.
Design, order, specificity, detail of instruction. Thank you, John. Other ideas? Brian, what do you think?
In answering this question, I'm a little confused as to where the temple and the tabernacle, where the tabernacle ends, where the temple begins. But ultimately, in my mind, the temple is the dwelling place of God. And then you get into the new covenant, and our flesh is the temple of God, where the Holy Spirit dwells, where Christ dwells. And then when you get over into Revelations, and you see the ultimate culmination of all that God has told us, well, in this physical life, that there is no temple, because God and the Lamb, we're united to God, and we, in essence, are the dwelling place. We're the stones that are being built into this home or house for God, and therefore there is no temple in heaven. It's God, Jesus, and his children.
Okay. Thank you, Brian. So the temple is, you say, loaded with significance both in the past and the future for Ezekiel, in the temple and tabernacle, as well as in images in the new covenant. And maybe one more idea on why God might have chosen to elaborately describe a building when trying to communicate the relationship he desires with his people. Let's go with Jim here. We'll bypass Michael in favor of age and wisdom here.
I'm coming at an answer a little different from what you're looking at, but
Good.
I look at the overall pattern of what God has expected of his people all through the ages, and he has always defined what he wanted, how he wanted it, whether it was the tabernacle and just different versions of his authority over assembling of people, a very detailed plan that he expects people to obey. You look at the design in the tabernacle, the several pages in there of every ring had to be a certain size and certain color, and that man can't say, well, Lord, you just didn't tell us what to do. And then over in Hebrews, in the 8th chapter, we've looked at that follow the pattern that was given to Moses in the wilderness. God's always had a pattern, and and it's a lesson for us that, hey, he means what he says, because Nadab and Abihu, they didn't go by the pattern, and others that have not gone by the pattern, then they had to pay the price. And so I think God, in a different sense, what you're saying, is telling everybody that of all ages since the creation, whenever there's details about what he expects in our worship, the kind of animals for every one of the feasts and all, and God has given that for a purpose, and it's not just to fill up space in here, but there's a purpose. And I just see in it God's plans for how he wants his people to act and treat themselves and worship him all the days of their life, and that we will have to give an account in the last day. And people of the world don't see that at all, and I think even too many of our own people can get a little bit lax sometimes in applying some of the things that we see.
Thank you, Jim. So I'm going to kind of pull a couple things from the three comments that were made, because there's maybe two elements of these chapters that are off-putting to us or weird to us. One is the fact that it is a temple. Okay, we're just not familiar with the idea of temple, but Brian reminds us that the temple was a really, really big deal, and the tabernacle before it was a really, really big deal for the Israelites. One way we might think of this is to say, for Ezekiel's readers, for Ezekiel's hearers, God is using something that they can relate to, something that they do understand very well. Okay. Now, we may have to do some work to get ourselves back in their frame of mind, but for them, there may be no better way to describe the relationship God has with his people than with a temple, because they were so familiar with that. And we've even talked in this class some about the destruction of the temple and trying to understand how big of a deal that was for them. And so in a similar way, we might say that's why God chooses to look forward to a new temple, because their hearts were so enlivened by the idea of finally having a temple again with which to dwell with God. And then the other part of this, to what John and Jim said, was the other thing that's weird about these chapters is the level of detail. Maybe we just need to roll up our sleeves and be okay with getting into the text and studying things, even if it's hard. But I'll connect it to the first point. any one of us could pick something that we're into that excites us, and probably most everybody else in the room finds it to be boring or obscure, right? Like fly fishing or something, right, John? Okay. But for us, my particular interest, there's no level of detail that's too great or too small, because I'm into that, and I get excited about it, and I want to learn all the various details. So think about that as it regards Ezekiel 40 to 48. If we approach this idea of a new temple in which God dwells with his people, if that excites us and, lights us up the same way that it would have Ezekiel's original readers, then, we're going to love poring over the details and getting into that and understanding the specificity with which God has described these things. Okay. So again, we'll continue to think some about, why this is here, talk more about what we're supposed to make of it as we go. But let's jump in, and Rick's going to substitute for me on Sunday while we're away, so I don't want to leave too much catch-up for Rick to do, since he's already doing me a favor. Let's look at the first 4 verses of this vision as it describes in Ezekiel 40 the when and the where and the who that is involved in this vision. Ezekiel 40 in verse 1 says, "In the 25th year of our exile, at the beginning of the year, on the 10th day of the month, in the 14th year after the city was struck down, on that very day, the hand of the Lord was upon me, and he brought me to the city. In the visions of God, he brought me to the land of Israel and set me down on a very high mountain, on which was a structure like a city to the south. When he brought me there, behold, there was a man whose appearance was like bronze, and with a linen cord and a measuring reed in his hand, and he was standing in the gateway. And the man said to me, Son of man, look with your eyes and hear with your ears, and set your heart upon all that I shall show you, for you were brought here in order that I might show it to you. Declare all that you see to the house of Israel." Okay, a few things here. One is the timing of this. It's easy to start ignoring it perhaps after a while, because Ezekiel does fairly often give us the date of when these prophecies were given or when God appeared to him. But this one we don't want to miss. He says this is in the 25th year of the exile. And a lot of people have picked up on this. Both Jewish readers of old and modern Christian readers have picked up the significance of the number 25. By the way, that number shows up a lot in the course of the description of the temple in these chapters. But this is the 25th year, and the idea is that this is a reference to the year of Jubilee, which in the Israelite calendar took place every 50 years. Now, it's not as tidy as saying, 25 years before this was the year of Jubilee, and so 25 years later will be the next, actual year of Jubilee. We're working more with symbols here, that for the people of Israel, just the number 25, or saying it's the 25th year, would have brought those associations with the year of Jubilee. The year of Jubilee was announced every 50 years, as we said, and announced on the Day of Atonement, which, by the way, is the 10th day of the 7th month. And this vision is not in the 7th month, it's at the first of the year, but it is on the 10th day. So that may be another connection here as well. You tell me, there's 2 things I have listed for you here on the handout. The 2 most significant things that happen in the year of Jubilee, remember what they are? Inherited land goes back to its original family, clan owner as decided by God back in the book of Joshua. And the other thing that happens? Slaves and debts are released. Okay? So, the year of Jubilee is a big deal. And in the course of our sermons on the holy days of the Old Testament, we'll probably talk about Jubilee at some point. But slaves are liberated, debts are forgiven, and property is restored to its original family or its original clan. And so you could see why it would be important for Ezekiel, for God, to have in the background the idea of a coming Jubilee as he gives this picture of the restored future. Especially with what the text tells us, that it's been 14 years since the city of Jerusalem was destroyed by the Babylonians. I don't know if there's a whole lot of significance to the year number 14, but just, think about it. You've been, that news was devastating enough when it happened, and then 14 years have passed since the city's been destroyed. That sense of hopelessness that we've talked about before, remember the valley of dry bones, anxiety, what is the future going to look like? Here we are over a decade since the city's been destroyed. What is in store for the people of God? And what's in store is, we're halfway to Jubilee, right? It's been dark. Maybe it's the darkest now, right? But now we're headed towards a bright future with the destruction of Jerusalem behind us, okay? All right, continuing to think symbolically here, the text tells us that Ezekiel is in visions of God. So, he's seeing this like we saw in previous visions in the book of Ezekiel. He's seeing this in a vision. And he's taken to a very high mountain in the land of Israel and sees off to the south of the mountain something like a great city. First of all, we'll notice a contrast to the last vision that he had in chapter 37, where he was down in a valley, again, the hopelessness down low in that valley, that dead valley of dry bones. Now he is brought up onto a mountain to see a glorious vision. But again, we're thinking symbolically here. Jerusalem is not actually, we always think about the mountain of God, Mount Zion. It's not that impressive of a mountain. It's hard to even call it a mountain at all. In fact, when you're standing on Mount Zion, you're standing in Jerusalem, you're looking around and you're seeing other hills and mountains that are taller than you are, right? And so when it says that Ezekiel is put down on a very high mountain, we're supposed to envision Jerusalem. Again, this is not literal geography as much as it is spiritual geography. Think of a passage, if Robert was here, if Robert's out there listening halfway across the world. Isaiah 2, for Robert's sake. The mountain of the house of the Lord, that all the nations flow up to it. That's a picture of what we're seeing here. And Ezekiel is greeted by an angelic messenger to guide him, to make these precise measurements for him. And the messenger tells Ezekiel to watch, to observe, and then to declare what he sees to all the house of Israel. It's on here. Maybe you can tell from the clues. Who does this remind us of that we've talked about? Seeing this vision and to go down and describe it to people? Yeah, sounds like Moses, right? And it is very much like what Moses sees on the Mount of Sinai, the vision of the heavenly reality that the tabernacle represents, and then going down and describing that to the people. But I will say, and we should point this out, we mentioned it or alluded to it on Sunday. There is a big difference here, though. Moses was shown this, and the reason he was shown it was because he was being very clearly instructed, go build this, okay, go make this. Nowhere in these chapters in Ezekiel is he told to go build this, or is he told to pass along instructions to build this temple. In fact, here and in other places, I gave you one reference. Oh, maybe I didn't give you reference here. But there will be some places later on in the vision where he's just told, you need to tell people what you're seeing so they can feel bad about themselves, basically. But just describe what you're seeing, not go build this or anything like that. But still, he has seen this heavenly reality and told to describe it to the people for some of the purposes that we've talked about already. Okay, maybe not a lot there. Maybe there is things there you want to talk about. Anything through the first 4 verses of Ezekiel 40? Comments or questions? Okay, here's what we're going to do next. Maybe spend the next 10 minutes or so thinking about and just pointing out some of the various features that Ezekiel is seeing and describing for us here in chapter 40. One of the internal debates I have is how much of this to just read. If you were on our Zoom class Monday night, you heard the very excellent way in which many of our men read through these chapters that are pretty difficult to read with all of the measurements and the descriptions. So I'm just going to leave this up here. This is a 3D diagram. You have your 2D diagram in front of you. I probably don't need to say this, but I will. you realize that any of these diagrams or pictures are interpreting certain elements or filling in certain elements that aren't clearly spelled out in the text. They're all going to look a little bit different. There's room for interpretation, but it's helpful to see something and then try to connect it to the passage and say, is that exactly what's being described? So look at your pictures, the one on the board, the one on your handout, and then on your the backside of your handout for tonight, I have listed some of the elements that we will mention over the next few minutes. But let's do a little bit of reading here. Why not? And in Ezekiel 40 and verse 5, we start our description with a wall. It says in verse 5, "Behold, there was a wall all around the outside of the temple area, and its length of the measuring reed in the man's hand was 6 cubits, each being a cubit and a handbreadth in length. So he measured the thickness of the wall 1 reed, and the height 1 reed." So we're given our conversions here, right? So the angel has a reed, a long stick, but each stick is 6 cubits. But the verse says it's not really a cubit, it's a cubit and a handbreadth. So a cubit is about 18 inches. Add an extra handbreadth for each cubit, that's 21 inches. And each reed, see, Alex has already fallen as he's yawning, he's just unashamedly saying, I can't handle this anymore, right? Sorry, Alex. 21 inches, each reed is 6 cubits, so that's what? 21 times 6, 126, did I do that right? What's 126 inches? That's over 10 feet, right? Am I doing that math right? So, over 10 feet long, this reed, and he's measuring the wall. I was wrong. I did my math wrong. That's over 10 feet thick. So you can correct that. I was not a math major. That was my wife. And so 10 feet thick walls, 10 feet high walls. Get a picture of that. And that would be the very outside of the complex here described in verse 5. Okay. As you see here, there are 3 gates. So it's not a gate on every side of the complex. There's nothing on the west side. There's no entrance over there. But there is an east, which is the main gate described in verse 6 to 15. So we'll keep reading here. It says, "He went into the gateway facing east, going up its steps, and measured the threshold of the gate 1 reed deep. And the side rooms, 1 reed long and 1 reed broad, and the space between the side rooms 5 cubits, and the threshold of the gate by the vestibule of the gate at the inner end 1 reed." I'm doing a much worse job than John did on Monday. "He measured the vestibule of the gateway on the inside 1 reed. He measured the vestibule of the gateway 8 cubits. Its jambs 2 cubits. Its vestibule of the gate at the inner end. There were 3 side rooms on either side of the east gate. 3 were the same size, and the jambs on either side were of the same size. Then he measured the width of the opening of the gateway, 10 cubits. The length of the gateway, 13 cubits. There was a barrier before the side rooms, 1 cubit on either side, and the side rooms were 6 cubits on either side. He measured the gate from the ceiling of the one side room to the ceiling of the other, a breadth of 25 cubits. The openings faced each other. He measured also the vestibule, 20 cubits. All around the vestibule of the gateway was the court. From the gate of the entrance to the front of the inner vestibule of the gate was 50 cubits. So basically, this is describing the little kind of gateway house here. And you notice that these little gate entrance structures here, they have something. They have steps leading up. So you have the big wall out front, and then you have steps to even get in the gate itself. And then you have a vestibule, so an entryway, and then you have rooms off to the side. As with other rooms in this description, it's not quite clear what these rooms are for. You may imagine like guard rooms. If these are the gateways into the temple complex, maybe people stand guard in these rooms. There seems to be little barriers, little fences, maybe that the guard would stand behind as they, position themselves in these gateways to protect the entrance to the temple. But if you went on to read verses 20 to 27, you would see that there are matching gateways just like this with all the same dimensions and rooms on the north and on the south of the temple complex. But it's this east one that is the main entrance, which, of course, was the way that the tabernacle and the temple were both laid out, with the east being the entrance to the complex. Okay? Do notice in verse 16, it says that the gateway had windows all around, narrowing inwards toward the side rooms and towards their jambs. And likewise, the vestibule had windows all around inside, and on the jambs were palm trees. Now, I highlight the palm trees because we highlighted those on Sunday in Solomon's temple. Remember, there were palm trees carved all along the inside of the temple. And we talked about the symbolism, the garden imagery there. Palm trees are a common symbol of fertility or of fruitfulness in the ancient world. And so we have palm trees depicted here on the jambs of these gateway entrances to the temple complex. Okay, how are we doing? We'll move a little bit quickly here and try to reserve the last 15 minutes or so for the spiritual principles. There are more rooms to talk about. So we saw the rooms in verse 10 that were in the gateway houses themselves, the entrance houses. But also in verse 17, it says that he brought me into the outer court, and behold, there were chambers and a pavement all around the court. 30 chambers faced the pavement, and the pavement ran alongside of the gates, corresponding to the length of the gates. This was the lower pavement. So he's talking about this big courtyard in the middle, but he says that around the courtyard are all of these rooms. On your two-dimensional diagram, you're just shown letter K where these rooms are, but you notice on the board it actually separates those out. You can count if you want. I'm assuming that the artist here got his 30 rooms in there exactly, but 30 rooms along the outside of the courtyard, which again, their purpose is a little bit unclear. Some people have thought they're for eating, the reference to kitchens and food preparation later in the vision, or maybe rooms for worshiping. But again, there are rooms regardless. And that courtyard is described. We read that in verse 17 and 18. And verse 19 says the measured distance from the inner front of the lower gate, that's here, okay? So the measurement from here to here, in verse 19 is 100 cubits. It's a long way. So 18 inches or 21 inches times 100. And that's true on the east, north, and south side. So not a lot is said about it, but there's this big courtyard area and the pavement running along the outside of that. Okay, then skipping ahead to verse 28. Yes, Brian. The outer is going to be this here. So between the gate houses and the inner courtyard is here once you go through. So these inner structures here, you see how it's basically replicated. There's an east and a north and a south entrance way. I'm sorry about that. We got to get that figured out. Robert, we need you to come back from Australia. If you can't fix it from there. But these inner gates, if you read in verse 28 to 37, you would see that there is more of everything that we've seen described. So you had to walk up 7 stairs to get into the courtyard through the outer gates, and then there's going to be 8 more stairs to go up the inner gateways into the inner courtyard. And there are more rooms there. There are more windows in those entrance houses, and there are more palm trees in the jambs of those entrances as well. And then in verses 38 to 43, we read about chambers. So we'll read a little bit here. Verse 38, there was a chamber with its door in the vestibule of the gate. Now we're on the inner gates here. So more vestibules there. And the inner gate says where the burnt offering was to be washed. Verse 39, in the vestibule of the gate were 2 tables on either side on which the burnt offering and the sin offering and the guilt offering were to be slaughtered. And off to the side and the outside as one goes up to the entrance of the north gate were 2 tables. On the other side of the vestibule of the gate were 2 tables, 4 tables on either side. That's 8 tables, he tells us, on which to slaughter. And there were 4 tables of hewn stone for the burnt offering, 1.5 cubits long and 1.5 cubits broad, 1 cubit high, on which the instruments were to be laid, with which the burnt offerings and the sacrifices were slaughtered. And hooks a handbreadth long were fastened all around within. The tables of the flesh offering was to be laid. So we have designated spaces here, designated spaces and tables and rooms for the washing, for the slaughtering, for the instruments that would be used on this inner chamber that would be used for the sacrifices. And then finally, for tonight, we'll point out the priestly chambers in verse 44, where it says that on the outside of the inner gateway there were 2 chambers in the inner court, one on the side of the north gate facing south, the other the side of the south gate facing north. And he said to me, this chamber that faces south is for the priests. So chambers on the inner court for the priests who have a charge of the temple. Notice verse 46, the chamber that faces north is for the priests who have the charge of the altar. These are the sons of Zadok, who alone among the sons of Levi may come near to the Lord and minister to him. He measured the court 100 cubits long and 100 cubits broad, a square, and the altar was in front of the temple. Okay, and we'll stop there in terms of our description for tonight, and Rick can pick up there in verse 48 as Ezekiel starts to make his way into the inner part of this temple complex. But we notice there are chambers at this entranceway for the priests, and it notes that the priests were not necessarily all the sons of Levi or even the sons of Aaron, but the sons of Zadok. And you have a note there in your handout that Zadok was the priest during the time of David. So there's another reference to David. And that name also means righteousness, Zadok. So, with about 13 minutes left here, 12 or 13 minutes left, let's talk about some spiritual principles. Although I guess I should give you, maybe not, opportunity to ask no questions, right, about any. I mean, that was just like clear as day, right? Anything you want to ask about what we've seen described? Can't guarantee I have an answer.
Go back and listen to the Sunday's class, but
Yes, we did.
okay, yeah.
Yeah.
There's similarities between this and Solomon's, or the first temple, and then there's obviously some striking differences. I would assume that would be notable to the exile readers about anything we should take from that in the sense of this somewhat resembles a temple, but there's several things that are completely different and obscure than what.
No, it's a good question. We talked about some related things on Sunday, which would maybe be this. From the similarities, I think they're supposed to take the symbolism and the importance, the significance of Solomon's temple is supposed to be translated and magnified in this temple. But it's different enough to where I think that was a strong clue to say this is not intended to be literally built. And think about it, when Zerubbabel and Jeshua and those guys came back, they didn't try to build this, right? They were building something that, now it wasn't quite Solomon's temple, wasn't as grand, but it was something much more resembling that than this. And I think the differences were a clue to say, we're stepping outside of the realm of the literal that God wants to be built and looking at something more symbolic. Does that make sense? Okay. So let's talk about some of those principles that we see at work here. 4 things you have on your handout. Let's start with this idea of new creation. We referenced this on Sunday, so I want to spend a little more time talking about it. I'm going to quiz you here. You can't look. Maybe you know what word goes in the blank here. In Genesis 1, on the first 3 days of creation, what's the verb, the primary verb that is used of what God did on the first 3 days of creation? Dustin nailed it. Gold star, chocolate, brownie points. Okay. It says in Genesis 1 over and over again that God separated. It doesn't say he made light and dark. He made sky and sea. It says that he separated light from dark. He separated the waters above from the waters below. He gathered, same idea, the dry land from the seas. The picture of Genesis 1 is, yes, of God making something from nothing. That's clear. But more particularly, the story of Genesis 1 is God bringing order to chaos. Genesis 1:3 or 2 and 3 is a picture of chaos, the darkness over the waters, right? It's chaotic. But God begins to separate, order, put everything in its rightful place. And Ezekiel 40 to 42, this picture of the future and a new creative work that God is going to undertake, this is one of the reasons why we have so much attention to detail and so much talk about spaces and walls and gates and things having their proper place. That's one of the things that's very clear in Ezekiel 40, and as we'll continue to see. Everything has its proper place, right? The room for the washing, the room for the slaughtering, the room for the priests, okay? Everything is separated, everything is ordered, and this represents what God does. And particularly, we'll do this one and then let you comment if you would like. Particularly what's being separated here is the holy from the profane. I think that's maybe one of the things we're supposed to think when you say, okay, why would this temple complex have such large barriers, right? It's a huge wall out front and the steps that lead up to the outer courtyard. In some ways, the courtyard itself, right, is, that distance creates space and separation and protection. And then you get in the inner, there's more stairs, there's more gates, etc. There is serious protection in Ezekiel's temple. And I think the idea is it keeps out what doesn't belong and it keeps in what does belong. And what is inside of God's presence and where God dwells is holiness, and what's outside is what's unclean and what's profane. And that word profane really just means common. And so the idea of something that is holy is something that is set apart, that is special. And God is holy. He is the most holy. He is the holy, holy, holy God. And so we see in this temple, again, a very over the top, but a very intensified picture of the guarding of what is holy and the protection around what is holy. By the way, this will connect to the next point as well. Going back to Genesis, remember one of the commandments given to Adam in Genesis chapter 2 was not only to cultivate or to tend the garden, but to keep it or to guard it. That's a protective word that God told Adam. Tend and keep, tend and guard the garden. And so God's holiness was always intended to be protected, to be kept safe. And we see that as a picture, a clear picture in Ezekiel 40 to 48, or at least so far in Ezekiel 40. Okay, comments or questions before the next two, number 3 and 4, spiritual principles here. Cool. To me, one of the more interesting aspects of this separation is the priesthood. And this goes back to Jordan's question. I mean, I think people reading this would have been shocked to say that, it's not just the sons of Levi, it's not the sons of Aaron, they're going to be priests. There's a distinction made here to say that it's going to be the sons of Zadok that are going to serve as priests, okay? So you see, it's like in the same kind of way that you can picture, separating out, what goes where. Of all the Levites, there are some that are separated out to be God's ministers. And it's not all the sons of Levi. In fact, later on in chapter 44 and verse 15, it'll indicate that only a certain group, only the sons of Zadok, were faithful to ministering, and to keeping themselves holy the way that God had instructed. And if you know the history of the Israelites, even the history of the priesthood, you'll remember that the priesthood intended to be God's holy ministers in the holy places. The priesthood became very corrupt and very common, very profane, okay? Starting with Nadab and Abihu, going through, the sons of Eli, and other examples besides. And it's that way in the time of Jesus and of the Apostle Paul as well. And so the priesthood itself has become unholy. And so there's a separation made here to where only those of righteousness, those who are the sons of Zadok, serve as priests in this new temple. Okay, and we'll end with this. It's maybe my favorite one. All the rooms that are in the new temple that Ezekiel sees, and we've talked about, what's the purpose of the rooms? Okay, and maybe there is intended to be some specific function if you're imagining how this might work. We mentioned for worship or for eating or for guarding or something. But it never really actually says. It just says over and over again that there's all these rooms. And I'll go back to something we said about the Solomon's temple in 1 Kings 6 to 8. Remember, Solomon's temple was always called a house in that section. That's how it refers to the temple. It was a house. It was a dwelling place for God, and specifically a place where God could dwell, live with his people. And so I think that again, one of the strongest images in Ezekiel's temple is the rooms. This is a dwelling place. This is a house where God and his people dwell together. And I think, I feel bad about this because this is going to burst the bubble of some of our old favorite hymns, right? I think this is what Jesus is talking about in John chapter 14 when he says, King James, worst translation of this particular verse, right, that's out there, unfortunately. The King James says, in my Father's house there are many mansions. Not at all what it means, at least the way we think of mansions, okay? In my Father's house there are many rooms is the idea, okay? That's the noun version. The word room is the noun version of the word abide that John uses over and over again, of dwelling. Jesus says, in my Father's house there are many rooms, there are many dwelling places, there are many abodes. And you're like, oh yeah, like Ezekiel's temple, there's lots of rooms. And even to that phrase, my Father's house, we may remember that earlier in the book of John, even in John chapter 2, Jesus goes into the temple and he sees what's going on and he says, my Father's house is not intended to be a house of merchandise, a house of trade, okay? So when Jesus earlier in the book said my Father's house, we knew he meant temple. And I think in John 14, when he says, in my Father's house, he's talking about the temple. So how exactly we interpret that, there may be some discussion there. Some have said that, as much as we think this is a verse about heaven, think about what Brian said earlier. If the Father's house, the temple, is the church, right, God's people, dwelling with him even now, then maybe Jesus is simply saying that he's going to do this great work of redemption so that we can dwell with God as the temple. But I would not rule out the sense that Jesus is looking ahead, looking to the future in which God will perfectly dwell with his people. But regardless of what we make of that, and I'd love to continue to discuss that more with you, I will suggest that when Jesus says, in my Father's house there are many rooms, he's thinking of Ezekiel and the vision of Ezekiel's temple. Okay. We never have time to do this, so I'll finally quiz you here. What's the significance of the when? Someone quickly. Significance of the 25th year of exile. Halfway to Jubilee. Significance of the where? Where is it? Yeah, high mountain, right? Glorious, transcendent, whatever you want to say about that. You remember any of the features from the temple complex? There's outer court, inner court. There's jams, there's a wall, there's a big wall. Jams is like the best word ever to say. So just remember they're jams, and the palm trees are the jams. And then what's one aspect of Ezekiel's temple you're going to think about after tonight? Dwelling place of God. What did you say? The mansion. That's right. I want that mansion over the hilltop. Yeah. Okay, well, on that note, we'll finish. And like I said, Rick is going to take up for us on Sunday. And if he's up for it, try to get through the next couple chapters of the book of Ezekiel. All right, that was fun as always. Thank you, guys.